She was 7 years old the night she saved a vampire king's dying son with 3 words in a language she wasn't supposed to know. Lena Volkov didn't understand why the kitchen staff whispered when she passed. Didn't know that her ability to hear conversations through walls would make her the most valuable witness in the immortal court. Didn't realize that speaking Russian in a kingdom where that language had been banned for 2 centuries would either get her killed or change her life forever. All she knew was that the little boy upstairs, the one with the sad silver eyes who never smiled, was going to die before morning. And the adults serving him his nightly glass of warm blood weren't going to stop it. They were counting on it. What Lena didn't know was that King Aleksander Nero had spent 300 years building walls around his heart. That his son Dmitri was the only crack in his armor. That losing the boy would finally break what centuries of war and betrayal hadn't managed to destroy. And that a 7-year-old kitchen girl with her mother's gift for languages was about to become the reason an ancient king remembered how to feel. Because some bonds aren't forged in romance or destiny. They're forged in desperation, in the moment when a child risks everything to save a stranger, and a monster learns that maybe, just maybe, he's still capable of loving something more than power. This is the story of how 3 words spoken in forbidden Russian created a debt that would span decades. How a little girl became a king's most trusted voice. And how the child who saved his son would one day become the woman who saved his soul. If you're ready to witness a bond that begins with poison and ends with devotion, hit subscribe now. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and whether you believe a monster can learn to love. Because tomorrow, I'll have another story that will break your heart and put it back together. Now, let's begin with a little girl who heard what she shouldn't have and spoke when silence would have been safer. Act 1. The World of Shadows, Establishing the Kingdom. The Crimson Palace wasn't a place for children. Lena had learned this within her first week of arrival, when she'd watched a servant boy her age get dragged screaming into the lower dungeons for dropping a tray of crystal goblets. He hadn't come back. Nobody talked about him. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist, erased from reality by his mistake. So Lena made herself very, very small. At 7 years old, she was already practiced in invisibility. Her mother, Lena Volkov, had taught her well before the fever took her 3 months ago. Keep your head down, Lapachka. Make yourself useful. Never, ever draw attention. The kitchen of the Crimson Palace was a vast cavern of stone and fire, where human cooks prepared meals for the mortal servants and blood sommeliers crafted elaborate presentations for the vampire nobility. Lena worked in the scullery, scrubbing pots until her small hands were raw and red, staying so quiet that sometimes the other servants forgot she was there. Which was exactly how she heard things she shouldn't. "The boy is weak," head sommelier Vasily muttered to his assistant as they prepared the evening's blood service. Lena was behind a stack of copper pots, invisible, her hands still moving through soapy water. 3 years old and still hasn't shown a single sign of turning. The king keeps hoping, but we all know the truth. Half-human children rarely survive the transition, the assistant replied, her voice carefully neutral. His mother was mortal. The blood is too thin. More than that, the boy is soft. Cries at loud noises. Flinches when the king raises his voice. What kind of heir is that for the Crimson Throne? Lena's hands stilled in the water. She knew who they meant. Prince Dmitri, the king's only child, a small boy with silver eyes who sometimes wandered into the kitchens looking lost. The servants treated him with icy deference, but Lena had noticed they never smiled at him. Never offered him the warmth they showed to visiting nobles' children. She'd seen him once, standing in a shadowed corridor, watching other children play in the courtyard below. He hadn't made a sound, hadn't called out to join them. Just watched with those sad, ancient eyes in his young face. "If the boy doesn't turn by his 5th birthday," Vasily continued, lowering his voice even further, "the council will demand the king's sire another heir. With a proper vampire consort this time. Not some human artist he became infatuated with. The king won't abandon his son. The king won't have a choice. The Crimson Throne requires strength. That boy will never be strong enough." Lena forced herself to keep scrubbing, to maintain the rhythm of her work. But something twisted in her chest. She knew what it felt like to be the weakness others wanted to erase. to be the inconvenient reminder of something lost. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, "You have a gift, Lena. You hear what others miss. But gifts can be dangerous if the wrong people notice them." Lena Volkov had been a translator before the wars, fluent in 7 languages including Russian, the tongue of the old empire that had fallen 2 centuries ago. She taught Lena in secret, whispering lessons in their cramped servants' quarters, making her daughter memorize grammar and vocabulary that no longer had any official use. "Why teach me a dead language, Mama?" "Because those who erase languages are trying to erase memory, Lepochka. And memory is the only thing that keeps truth alive." 3 months later, Katya was gone, and Lena was alone in a palace full of monsters who'd forgotten how to be anything else. The evening bell tolled, signaling the preparation of the royal family's blood service. Lena watched from her hidden position as Vasily prepared an ornate crystal decanter, filling it with blood so dark it looked black in the firelight. "The prince's evening portion," Vasily announced to his assistant. "He takes it warm, with a drop of honey to mask the taste. The king insists, even though it makes the boy weaker, coddling him like a human child." The assistant prepared a smaller crystal glass, adding the honey with practiced precision. But then Vasily turned away to address a cook, and Lena saw something that made her blood freeze. The assistant reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a small vial, uncorked it with trembling hands and tipped 3 drops of clear liquid into the prince's glass. It happened in seconds. The woman recorked the vial, slipped it back into her pocket, and swirled the glass gently to mix the contents. By the time Vasily turned back, the assistant was placing the prince's portion on a silver tray with steady hands and a blank expression. "Poison." Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd just witnessed someone poison the vampire prince's blood. The heir to the Crimson Throne. The king's only son. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, stay small, stay alive. This wasn't her business. She was a kitchen girl, a nobody, invisible by design and necessity. Speaking up would draw attention, would make her visible, would mark her as a witness who needed to be silenced. But she thought of those sad silver eyes. Of a small boy who stood alone in corridors and watched other children play. Who cried at loud noises and flinched when his father raised his voice because he was too soft for this brutal world. "You have a gift, Lena. You hear what others miss." The tray was being carried toward the door. In minutes, it would be delivered to the prince's chambers. In an hour, the boy would drink it. By morning, he'd be dead, and everyone would assume his weak half-human blood had finally given out. Lena made a choice. She dropped the pot she'd been scrubbing. It clattered against stone, soapy water splashing across the floor. Every head turned toward the noise. "Clumsy child," Vasily snapped. "Clean that up immediately." I'm sorry," Lena stammered, grabbing a cloth, making herself even more visible in her panic. She scrubbed at the spilled water, working her way closer to the door, closer to the servant carrying the tray. The woman brushed past her, and Lena made her move. She stood abruptly, directly in the servant's path, causing the woman to stumble. The tray tilted. The prince's glass slid toward the edge. The servant caught it just in time, but the sudden movement sloshed liquid over the rim, a few precious drops spilling onto the silver tray. "You stupid girl," the servant hissed, fury and fear warring in her eyes. "Do you have any idea what you've done? If the prince's portion is ruined, I'll prepare another," Vasily said coldly, appearing at Lena's shoulder. His hand clamped down with bruising force. "And you, child, will learn to watch where you walk. Take her to the scullery supervisor. 20 lashes should teach her proper attention." 20 lashes. Lena had seen what that did to servants. Had seen them unable to work for weeks, backs flayed open, infections setting in. Some died from it. But the poison glass was being carried back to the preparation table. The servant who'd added the vial was pale, watching with wide eyes as Vasily poured the contaminated blood down the drain and prepared a fresh portion. The prince would live. At least for tonight. As the supervisor's assistant dragged Lena toward the punishment room, she caught a glimpse of the poisoning servant's face. The woman looked relieved and terrified in equal measure. And Lena realized with cold certainty, this wasn't over. They'd try again. Maybe tomorrow night. Maybe next week. But they'd try again, and next time, she wouldn't be there to cause an accident. Unless she did something impossibly stupid. Unless she spoke. Act 2, the breaking point, the cruel word. The lashing didn't happen. Lena was shoved into a small stone room and told to wait for the supervisor, but an hour passed, then 2. She huddled in the corner, her mind racing. The kitchen staff had forgotten her again, distracted by the dinner service for a visiting delegation of vampire nobles. Finally, a junior servant opened the door. "You're wanted in the prince's quarters," she said, her voice flat with disinterest. "One of the upstairs maids is ill. You'll serve the prince his evening blood and attend to his chambers tonight." Lena's throat went dry. "Me? Do you see anyone else here? Don't keep the prince waiting." She followed the servant through corridors of cold marble and flickering torchlight, up spiral staircases that seemed to climb forever, into regions of the palace she'd never seen. The walls here were draped in crimson silk. Ancient portraits of vampire kings stared down with eyes that seemed to follow her movement. They reached a heavy oak door carved with symbols Lena didn't recognize. The servant knocked twice, then pushed it open. "The evening service, Your Grace," she announced to empty air, then shoved Lena inside and closed the door behind her. The prince's chambers were vast and cold. Despite the fire burning in an ornate hearth, the room felt like winter. Heavy curtains blocked out any hint of moonlight. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and strange artifacts that gleamed in the firelight. And in the center of the room, sitting in a chair too large for his small frame, was Prince Dmitri. He looked even smaller than Lena remembered. 3 years old, maybe 4, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent and silver eyes that held too much sadness for such a young face. He wore dark velvet clothes that looked expensive and uncomfortable, his small hands folded precisely in his lap. He didn't look at her when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. Lena had been given a tray with a fresh crystal glass of blood, warm, with honey, exactly as the prince preferred. She approached slowly, carefully, keeping her movements small and unthreatening. "Your evening portion, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dimitri's eyes flickered toward her briefly, then away. He didn't reach for the glass. Lena set the tray on a small table beside his chair and stepped back, uncertain. Was she supposed to wait? The servant who'd brought her had provided no instructions. The silence stretched. The fire crackled. Dmitri stared at nothing. "You don't have to drink it if you don't want to," Lena said quietly, surprising herself. The prince's eyes snapped to her face. Really looked at her for the first time. Up close, she could see that his silver eyes were actually gray, like storm clouds or steel. Old eyes in a young face. "Father says I must," Dmitri said. His voice was soft, carefully modulated, as if he'd been taught to control every inflection. "To grow strong. To become what I'm supposed to be." "What are you supposed to be?" "A king." The words sounded heavy coming from such a small mouth. "But I won't be. I'm not strong enough. Everyone knows it." Lena thought of Vasily's words. "The boy is weak. What kind of heir is that for the Crimson Throne?" "My mama used to say that strength isn't just about being loud or scary," Lena offered. She said sometimes the strongest people are the ones who stay gentle in a world that wants them to be hard. Dmitri studied her with those ancient eyes. "Your mother sounds wise. Where is she now?" "Dead. 3 months ago. Fever." "I'm sorry." And the way he said it, Lena knew he understood loss intimately. "My mother died too. When I was born. Father says she was beautiful and kind and everything good. He says I look like her." He said it like a confession, like a flaw he couldn't help. "That sounds like a nice thing to look like," Lena said. For the first time, something that might have been a smile flickered across Dimitri's face. It vanished almost immediately, but Lena had seen it. Then the door opened. A vampire entered, tall and cold and moving with predatory grace. Lena recognized him from glimpses in the corridors. Lord Constantine, one of the king's high counselors. He was ancient, his face sharp and aristocratic, his eyes like chips of black ice. "Your Grace," he said to Dmitri, not acknowledging Lena at all. Your father requests your presence in the council chamber. There are visiting nobles who wish to meet the heir. Dmitri's small body went rigid. Now. Immediately. But I haven't finished my evening portion. Bring it with you. The king insists you maintain your schedule. Constantine's gaze finally flickered to Lena. Girl, tend the prince. Carry his glass. Lena picked up the crystal glass with trembling hands. She followed as Dmitri was led through corridors, down staircases, toward the center of the palace where power resided. They entered a massive chamber lined with ancient weapons and faded banners from long-ago wars. A long table dominated the room, surrounded by vampire nobles who turned to watch as Dmitri entered. And at the head of the table sat King Aleksander Nero. Lena had never seen the king before. Had only heard stories whispered in the kitchens. They said he'd ruled for 3 centuries. That he'd unified the vampire territories through a combination of brilliant strategy and absolute ruthlessness. That he could kill with a look and had done so countless times. Looking at him now, Lena believed every story. He was beautiful in the way winter is beautiful, cold and sharp and merciless. Tall, with broad shoulders wrapped in black velvet and silver thread. Dark hair that fell to his shoulders. And eyes the color of fresh blood under moonlight that saw everything and forgave nothing. When those eyes landed on Dmitri, something flickered in them. Something that might have been love, or might have been disappointment, or both tangled together until they were indistinguishable. Dmitri, the king said, his voice deep and resonant. Meet Lord Ravenshield and his sons from the northern territories. The visiting nobles were massive, all hard angles and military bearing. They studied Dmitri the way wolves study prey, assessing weakness. Dmitri walked forward with careful steps. He bowed precisely, exactly as he'd been taught. Lord Ravenshield. Welcome to the Crimson Palace. A pretty child, Lord Ravenshield said, and the word, pretty, sounded like an insult. Does he train in combat yet, Your Majesty? He is young, Alexander said, an edge in his voice. My youngest son began weapons training at 2, Ravenshield continued. By 4, he could hold his own against grown warriors. The vampire blood grants us strength early. If it's pure enough. The implication hung in the air like poison. Dmitri's small shoulders tensed. Lena, standing forgotten by the wall with the glass still in her hands, saw the boy's fingers curl into fists. Dmitri will train when I deem him ready, Alexander said, his tone dropping to something dangerous. Of course, Your Majesty. I merely wonder. Ravenshield leaned back in his chair, affecting casual interest. The boy's mother was human, yes? How long before we know if the turning will take? Some half-blood children never transition. They remain fragile. My son is not fragile. Forgive me, Your Majesty. I meant no offense. But Ravenshield's smile suggested otherwise. I'm merely concerned for the succession. The Crimson Throne requires strength. Perhaps if the boy proves unsuitable, you might consider siring another heir? My daughter is of pure bloodline and excellent temperament. The union would strengthen both our territories. The room went very quiet. Even the other nobles seemed to sense they were witnessing something dangerous unfold. Alexander stood slowly, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Are you suggesting my son is unsuitable to inherit? I'm suggesting contingency planning, Your Majesty. If the boy cannot turn, cannot fight, cannot rule. Father. Dmitri's small voice cut through the tension. May I be excused? I'm not feeling well. Every head turned toward the boy. Lena saw what they all saw. Dmitri's pale face had gone even paler, his small body swaying slightly. Alexander's expression shuddered. You've barely arrived. I know, Father. I'm sorry. Dmitri wavered on his feet. Lord Constantine appeared at the boy's side. Your Grace, perhaps you should drink your evening portion. You missed your usual time. He gestured to Lena. She approached on trembling legs, offering the crystal glass to Dmitri. The boy reached for it with a shaking hand. And Lena saw it. The servant from the kitchen, the one who'd added the poison, standing in the shadows near the door. Watching. Waiting. Time seemed to slow. Dimitri's fingers closed around the glass. He lifted it toward his lips. Lena's mother's voice echoed in her memory. Those who erase languages are trying to erase memory. And memory is the only thing that keeps truth alive. She'd witnessed a murder about to happen. If she stayed silent, the boy would die. The kitchen servant would disappear into the shadows. And everyone would assume the weak half-human prince had simply failed to thrive. But if she spoke, if she revealed what she'd seen, she'd mark herself as dangerous. As someone who heard too much, saw too much, knew too much. Her mother had taught her to stay small, stay invisible, stay alive. But her mother had also taught her Russian. Had taught her to recognize truth and speak it, even when silence was safer. Lena made her choice. She dropped to her knees in front of Dmitri and spoke in Russian, the forbidden language, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. Господин, tуда otravil vashego syna. Sir, someone poisoned your son. Act 3. The silence that followed. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Dmitri froze, the glass halfway to his lips. Lord Constantine's hand shot out, staying the boy's movement. Every vampire in the room went utterly still, heads snapping toward Lena with predatory focus. And King Alexander's blood-red eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her lungs seize. "What?" he said, his voice deadly soft. "Did you just say?" Lena's entire body shook, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. She repeated the words in Russian, slower this time. Tuda otravil yego krov. Vi kukni. Ya vidila. Someone poisoned his blood. In the kitchen. I saw it. The child speaks the forbidden tongue, Lord Ravenshield said, genuine shock breaking through his aristocratic composure. That language was outlawed after the Eastern Purges. How does a kitchen girl? Silence. Alexander didn't raise his voice, but Ravenshield's mouth snapped shut. The king descended from his position at the table, crossing the chamber with fluid, terrible grace until he stood directly before Lena. Up close, he was even more terrifying. Ancient power rolled off him in waves. This was a creature who'd lived for centuries, who'd killed thousands, who could end her life with a casual gesture. Repeat what you said, Alexander commanded. In the common tongue. Every word. Lena's voice came out as a whisper. I said someone poisoned the prince's blood, Your Majesty. In the kitchen. I saw a servant add something to his glass from a vial. I tried to spill it, to ruin the portion so they'd have to make a new one, but they punished me and sent me up here and, her words tangled together, terror making her ramble. Show me. Alexander plucked the crystal glass from Dimitri's frozen grip and held it out to Lena. Show me what you saw. With trembling hands, Lena mimed the servant's actions. The vial. The 3 drops. The swirling to mix. Lord Constantine moved with vampire speed, appearing at Alexander's shoulder. Your Majesty, we should have this tested immediately. If the child speaks truth. If she speaks truth, someone in my palace tried to murder my son. Alexander's voice was soft, but underneath it was something molten and furious. If she lies, she's created a panic using a forbidden language to add credence to her story. His eyes never left Lena's face. Either way, this child has information I need. He turned to the assembled nobles. Lord Ravenshield, our discussion is postponed. Constantine, take the glass to the palace alchemist. Have it analyzed immediately. I want results within the hour. And the girl, Your Majesty? She stays with me. Alexander's hand descended on Lena's shoulder. His grip wasn't painful, but it was inescapable, a predator's hold that communicated absolute control. We're going to have a very thorough conversation about what she saw, who taught her Russian, and why she chose this moment to reveal both. Lena's legs nearly buckled. She was going to die. She'd saved the prince, but she'd condemned herself in the process. Father! Dimitri's small voice was barely audible. Please don't hurt her. She was trying to help me. Something flickered across Alexander's face. His eyes dropped to his son, and for a heartbeat, the ancient king looked almost human. Almost vulnerable. Go to your chambers, Dmitri. I'll come see you shortly. But father. Now. The word was absolute. Dmitri flinched, that familiar withdrawal Lena had seen before. The boy bowed precisely and left the chamber without another word, his small form disappearing into the corridor. When the door closed behind him, Alexander's attention returned to Lena with renewed intensity. "Walk with me, child. And pray that my alchemist confirms your story. Because if you've lied to create drama, if you've used forbidden language to spread false accusations..." He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. They walked through corridors in silence, his hands still on her shoulder, guiding her through the palace like a jailer leading a prisoner to execution. Other servants pressed themselves against walls as they passed, eyes wide with terror and fascination. Finally, they reached a private study. Alexander closed the door, and the sound of it shutting felt like a tomb being sealed. The room was lined with books, maps, weapons mounted on walls. A massive desk dominated the space, covered in documents written in languages Lena didn't recognize. Everything about the room spoke of power, strategy, the machinery of rule. Alexander moved to stand behind his desk, putting the massive piece of furniture between them. Distance and dominance. He steepled his fingers and studied her with those ancient eyes. "Your name," he said. "Lena Volkov, your majesty." Volkov. He repeated the name slowly as if tasting it. "Eastern origin. Your family came from the territories before the purges." "My mother did, your majesty. She was born in Vladimirsk before it fell." "And she taught you Russian. A language that's been forbidden for 2 centuries. A language whose speakers were executed during the Eastern purges to prevent exactly the kind of hidden communications that enabled the rebellion." His eyes narrowed. Why would she take such a risk? Why teach her daughter something that could get them both killed? Lena thought of her mother, of late nights and whispered lessons, of Katya's insistence that some knowledge was worth preserving even at terrible cost. "She said those who erase languages are trying to erase memory," Lena said quietly. "And memory is the only thing that keeps truth alive." Alexander's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or the acknowledgement of an uncomfortable truth. "Your mother was a philosopher, it seems. And a dangerous one." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me everything you saw in the kitchen. Leave nothing out. Every detail matters." So Lena told him. About Vasily and his assistant preparing the evening's blood service. About the conversation she'd overheard regarding Dmitri's weakness. About the moment the assistant pulled the vial from her pocket and added 3 drops to the prince's portion. "Can you describe this servant?" Alexander asked. Lena closed her eyes, pulling up the memory. Tall. Dark hair in a braid. Scar across her left hand. I saw it when she held the vial. She wore the kitchen assistant's uniform, green apron over black dress. She had an accent when she spoke. Northern territories, maybe? An accent. Alexander's eyes gleamed. From Ravenshield's territory. How interesting. And after she poisoned the glass, what happened? I dropped a pot to cause a distraction. Spilled water. Made the servant carrying the tray stumble so some of the blood would spill. They made a fresh portion and sent the poisoned one down the drain. You deliberately caused a scene to save my son's life. Yes, Your Majesty. Knowing you'd be punished for it. Yes, Your Majesty. Why? The question hung in the air. Lena met his gaze and saw genuine curiosity there, beneath the layers of cold authority. Because he's just a little boy, she said simply. And everyone keeps saying he's weak, but being soft isn't the same as being weak. It just means he hasn't turned hard yet. And I thought. She swallowed. I thought maybe he shouldn't have to. Turn hard, maybe someone should let him stay gentle. Silence. Alexander stared at her as if she'd spoken in a language far more foreign than Russian. Then a knock at the door shattered the moment. Enter, Alexander commanded. Lord Constantine stepped inside, carrying the crystal glass on a silver tray. His face was grim. Your Majesty. The alchemist has confirmed it. Wolfsbane extract, 3 drops, enough to kill a full vampire in agony over several hours. For a child, especially one who hasn't completed his turning. He didn't finish. It would have been excruciating, Alexander said flatly. And they would have blamed his weak blood. Tragedy. A failed transition. An unfortunate but inevitable conclusion to a doomed experiment in mixing bloodlines. He stood abruptly, violence coiled in every movement. I want that kitchen assistant found. And I want to know who gave her the wolfsbane, who instructed her to use it, and which noble house is behind this attempted murder. Already done, Your Majesty. The woman tried to flee when I retrieved the glass for testing. My guards apprehended her in the lower tunnels. Constantine's smile was sharp. She's in the interrogation cells. Awaiting your pleasure. Alexander moved toward the door, then paused. He looked back at Lena, still standing small and terrified in the center of his study. You saved my son's life, he said. That creates a debt I don't take lightly. What would you ask of me as reward? A better position? Freedom from service. Lena thought about what she'd witnessed tonight. The poisoning. The casual cruelty of nobles discussing Dmitri like he was defective merchandise. The lonely sadness in a little boy's eyes. I want to stay, she said. Alexander's eyebrows rose. Stay. With the prince. As his attendant. He needs someone who. She searched for the words. Someone who doesn't think he's broken. Someone who lets him be soft without calling it weakness. For a long moment, Alexander said nothing. Then, impossibly, something that might have been respect flickered across his ancient face. You ask to bind yourself to the most vulnerable position in the palace. To attach your fate to a child that half the court wants dead. That's either profound loyalty or profound stupidity. Maybe both, Your Majesty. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Very well, Lena Volkov. You'll serve as Dmitri's personal attendant. You'll attend his lessons, serve his meals, guard his chambers. And if you hear anything, any whisper, any plot, any danger, you'll report it directly to me. Do you understand? Yes, Your Majesty. Good. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing. That forbidden language your mother taught you? Don't stop using it. At least not in my hearing. If there are other Russian speakers plotting in my palace, I need someone who can understand them. He left before Lena could respond, sweeping out with Lord Constantine at his heels, leaving her alone in the study with her heart pounding and the sudden realization that she'd just transformed from invisible kitchen girl to the vampire king's secret weapon. And somewhere in the palace, a 3-year-old boy with sad silver eyes was waiting, having no idea that the girl who'd saved his life was about to become the most important person in his. Act 4. The years between, building the bond. 5 years later. Again, Dmitri said, his young voice patient despite the frustration. Lena sighed and repositioned her wooden practice sword, trying to remember the defensive stance the weapons master had demonstrated that morning. At 12 years old, she was gangly and awkward, all elbows and knees, while 8-year-old Dmitri moved with the fluid grace that came naturally to vampire children. I'm never going to get this, she muttered in Russian, the language they used when alone together. You will. Dmitri responded in the same language, his accent perfect despite his young age. You're thinking too much. Feel the movement instead. They were in the private training courtyard attached to Dmitri's chambers, a space Alexander had approved for his son's use. Officially, Dmitri was learning combat forms. Unofficially, Lena had insisted on learning alongside him, arguing that if she was to protect the prince, she should know how to fight. Alexander had looked at her for a long moment, then simply handed her a practice sword. Try not to impale yourself, he'd said drily. That had been 3 years ago. Now, training together was as natural as breathing. Dmitri lunged, and Lena barely managed to parry, her wooden blade clacking against his. He pressed the attack, moving faster, forcing her to react on instinct rather than thought. Better, he said, circling her. Now counterattack. Don't just defend. Lena swept her blade low, going for his legs. Dmitri leaped over the strike with inhuman agility, landing behind her. She spun, already knowing he'd be there, and their swords met with a satisfying crack. Excellent, a voice said from the doorway. They both froze. Alexander stood watching them, his expression unreadable. He'd been gone for 3 weeks, touring the northern territories, and Lena felt a little jolt in her chest at seeing him again. No, she corrected herself firmly. That wasn't a jolt. That was just surprise. Normal surprise at the king's return. "Father!" Dmitri dropped his practice sword and ran to Alexander, who caught the boy in an embrace that looked almost natural now. 5 years of Lena's gentle insistence had slowly thawed the king's rigid formality with his son. "You've improved," Alexander said, releasing Dmitri but keeping one hand on the boy's shoulder. "Both of you. The weapons master tells me you practice 4 hours daily." "Lena made me promise," Dmitri said. "She says that even if I don't like fighting, I should know how, just in case." Alexander's eyes moved to Lena, and she felt that familiar weight of his attention. Over 5 years, she'd grown accustomed to it. "Mostly." "Wise counsel," he said. "May I speak with your attendant privately, Dmitri?" The boy's silver eyes flickered between them, curious but not concerned. He'd long since stopped fearing his father's private conversations with Lena. They happened regularly now, part of the strange dynamic that had developed. "I'll go practice my languages," Dmitri said, heading inside. "Lady Katerina is teaching me French today." When they were alone, Alexander moved to stand beside Lena at the courtyard's edge. They stood in silence for a moment, watching storm clouds gather over the distant mountains. "Lord Ravenshield's daughter sends her regards," Alexander said finally. "She's disappointed that Dmitri wasn't present for the territorial summit. She'd hoped to meet her future husband." Lena's hands clenched. "She's 17 and he's 8. That's not a courtship, it's grooming. That's politics." But there was no heat in Alexander's voice. "The marriage was arranged before Dmitri was born. It secures the Northern Alliance." "Does Dmitri know?" "Not yet. There's time before he needs to carry that weight." "He should know," Lena said quietly. "He should know what's expected of him so he can prepare. Secrets just make the truth hurt worse when it finally comes." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "You've become remarkably bold in your counsel, Lena Volkov. Most wouldn't dare instruct a king on how to parent his own son. You told me to speak freely. Those were your exact words 5 years ago." "So I did." He turned to look at her, really look at her, and Lena felt suddenly conscious of how she'd changed. No longer a terrified 7-year-old, but a young woman finding her voice. "You've kept my son alive through 3 assassination attempts, exposed 2 coup plots, and translated intelligence from Russian operatives that prevented a territorial war. I think you've earned the right to speak freely." Lena felt warmth bloom in her chest. Approval from Alexander was rare and precious. "The Northern Summit," she said, forcing herself to focus. "Did you learn anything about who's funding the resistance cells?" "Always working." The corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but close. "Yes." Lord Constantine identified the source. "We'll handle it quietly." They fell into easy silence. This was what they'd become over 5 years. Not friends, exactly, but something more complex. King and advisor. Ancient vampire and mortal girl. 2 people who'd started as executioner and potential victim and become something neither could quite name. "Dmitri's turning is beginning," Alexander said abruptly. "The healers confirmed it last week. His fangs are developing. His strength is increasing. By his 10th birthday, he'll complete the transition." "That's good news." "It is. It means he'll survive. That he can inherit. That all those nobles who whispered about his weakness will have to swallow their doubts." Alexander's voice softened. "It means the choice I made, keeping him, raising him despite the court's objections, was right." "You never doubted that," Lena said. "Didn't I?" He looked at her with those ancient blood-red eyes. "Every time someone suggested I sire another heir, every time Dmitri flinched from loud noises or cried over things that should have meant nothing to a vampire prince, part of me wondered if they were right. If I was being sentimental. If I was choosing my son over my kingdom's strength." "You were choosing love," Lena said quietly. "That's not weakness. That's what makes you different from rulers like Ravenshield who see their children as political assets instead of people." Alexander stared at her. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of her dark hair behind her ear. The gesture was gentle, almost tender. "How did you become this?" he asked softly. "This fearless creature who speaks truth to monsters?" Lena's breath caught. His hand was still near her face, fingers just barely grazing her cheek. "I learned from watching you," she said. "You taught me that monsters are just people who forgot how to be anything else. And that sometimes they can remember." They stood frozen in that moment, the air between them charged with something Lena didn't have words for. Something that made her heart race and her skin feel too warm. Then Dimitri's voice called from inside. "Lena, come help me with this translation. I can't figure out the subjunctive tense." The spell broke. Alexander stepped back, his expression shuddering into formal distance once more. "Attend to my son," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I have council business to address." He left before Lena could respond. She stood in the courtyard, her face still warm where his fingers had touched, and tried to convince herself that she'd imagined the entire exchange. But she couldn't forget the look in his eyes. The softness that had crept in around the edges of his usual ice. And she couldn't ignore the flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a dangerous, impossible longing that she had no right to feel. Act 5. The shift 8 years later. Lena at 20, Dimitri at 16. The ballroom of the Crimson Palace glittered with chandelier light and vampire nobility. Lena stood at the edge of the celebration, watching Dimitri dance with Lady Svetlana Ravenshield for the third time that evening. She was beautiful, Lena had to admit. 17 now, with moon-pale skin, golden hair, and the practiced grace of someone raised specifically to be a queen. She smiled at Dimitri with perfect warmth, said all the right things, and never once flinched when his fangs showed as he laughed. The perfect future queen for the heir to the Crimson Throne. Lena looked away, focusing instead on scanning the crowd for threats. It was easier than watching Dimitri charm the woman he was contractually obligated to marry in 2 years' time. "You're brooding," Alexander's voice said in Russian, appearing at her shoulder like smoke. Lena didn't startle anymore. She'd grown accustomed to the king materializing without warning. "I'm working," she replied in the same language. "Lord Petrov's guards keep touching their weapons when they look at Dimitri. I don't like it. I noticed. Constantine has people watching them." Alexander handed her a glass of wine. "You're off duty for the evening." Dimitri's engagement celebration should include his closest advisor actually celebrating. "I don't celebrate political arrangements." "Neither do I. But we pretend, because that's what power requires." He took a sip of his own wine, watching his son with an expression Lena had learned to read over 13 years. Pride mixed with melancholy. "He's happy. That's what matters." Was he? Lena studied Dimitri's face as he danced. He looked happy. Smiled at the right moments. Held Svetlana with appropriate romantic attention. But she'd known him since he was 3 years old. She saw the tightness around his eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach them. "He's performing," Lena said quietly. "The same way you're performing right now. The same way I am. We're all pretending this is something other than a political merger dressed in romance." Alexander's eyes slid to her. "And what would you prefer it to be?" The question felt loaded with meaning she wasn't ready to examine. Before she could answer, the music stopped. Lord Ravenshield stood, raising his glass for a toast. The ballroom fell silent. "To my daughter Svetlana and Prince Dimitri," he boomed. "May their union bring strength, prosperity, and powerful heirs to both our houses." Everyone drank. Applauded. And Lena felt something twist in her chest that she'd been trying to ignore for years now. Later that night, after the celebration had ended and the nobles had retired to their guest chambers, Lena found Dimitri in his study. He was still in his formal clothes, but he'd loosened the collar, looking more like himself than the perfect prince he'd performed all evening. "You can stop pretending now," Lena said in Russian, closing the door behind her. Dimitri looked up from the book he'd been staring at without reading. "Was I that obvious?" "To me, yes. You're getting better at the performance." He laughed, but it sounded tired. 13 years of practice. You'd think I'd be perfect by now. He set the book aside. She's nice, Lena. Svetlana. She's intelligent and kind and genuinely interested in governance. I could do much worse. But you don't love her. Love is a luxury for people who aren't heirs to vampire kingdoms. He said it like he was quoting someone, probably his father. I'll learn to love her. After the wedding. After we build a life together. Lena moved to stand beside his chair, the way she'd done countless times over the years. Or you could tell your father you want to choose your own bride. And risk the Northern Alliance? Start a territorial conflict? My personal happiness isn't worth war, Lena. Your father would understand, she said quietly. He married for love once. With your mother. And she died. And he spent decades regretting it, because raising a half-human son weakened his political position. Dmitri looked up at her with those silver eyes that had grown from sad to wise. He made his choice. Now I'm making mine. The kingdom needs this alliance. Lena knew she should agree. Should support his noble sacrifice. Should be the advisor who put kingdom above personal feeling. But looking at Dmitri, gentle, thoughtful Dmitri who'd stayed soft in a world of hard edges, she couldn't force the words out. You deserve to be happy, she said instead. Dmitri reached up and took her hand. The gesture was familiar, comfortable, 13 years of friendship compressed into the simple touch. I am happy, he said. I have you. I have father, who actually talks to me now instead of giving commands from a distance. I have a kingdom that will let me rule my own way. That's more than most princes get. He stood, still holding her hand. And in 2 years, I'll marry a perfectly suitable woman who will give me perfectly suitable heirs, and life will continue. It's not a tragedy, Lena. It's just practical. Lena wanted to argue. Wanted to shake him and tell him that practical wasn't the same as right. But she'd learned when to push and when to let go. Get some sleep, she said instead. You have weapons training at dawn. Yes, mother, he teased, releasing her hand. Lena left him there, but instead of returning to her chambers, she found herself walking through the palace corridors toward the king's private study. It was late, well past midnight, but she knew Alexander would still be working. She knocked softly. Enter, came the response. The study looked exactly as it had 13 years ago, frozen in time while everything else changed. Alexander sat behind his massive desk, reviewing documents by candlelight, still in his formal clothes from the celebration. He looked up when she entered. Shouldn't you be resting? You've been on duty since dawn. I need to talk to you about Dmitri's engagement. Something flickered across Alexander's face. He set down his quill. Has something happened? Did Raven shield? Nothing happened. Everything went perfectly. That's the problem. Lena moved closer to the desk. Dmitri is going to marry Svetlana because it's practical. Because it's what's expected. Because he thinks making himself happy would be selfish. It would be. He's a prince. Personal happiness is a luxury we sacrifice for duty. Like you did. The words came out sharper than intended. Like you sacrificed your happiness when you married Dmitri's mother? Alexander's eyes went cold. That was different. How? You loved her. You married her despite the political consequences. You chose love over duty. And it killed her. The words were flat, final. My choice to marry a human, to indulge my feelings, created a son the court spent years trying to murder. So forgive me if I don't encourage Dmitri to make the same mistake. Lena felt the familiar frustration that came from arguing with someone who'd built walls around the truth. It wasn't a mistake. Dmitri is the best thing you've ever done. He's gentle and thoughtful and kind, everything this kingdom needs in a ruler. Your wife gave you that. Her humanity gave him that. Her humanity nearly got him killed. Repeatedly. Alexander stood, agitation breaking through his usual control. Do you know how many plots I've stopped? How many nobles wanted him dead or replaced? The only reason he survived was because you were there, speaking their forbidden languages, hearing their whispered treason. Exactly. He survived. Because you protected him. Because you chose love over convenience and fought for it every day since. Lena moved around the desk, eliminating the barrier between them. So why are you letting him settle for an arranged marriage when you know what real love feels like? Alexander looked at her, and for a moment, she saw past the ancient king to the man beneath. The man who'd lost his wife, who'd raised a son alone, who'd spent centuries building walls and had slowly, painfully learned to let them crumble for the people he loved. Because I don't want him to suffer what I suffered, Alexander said quietly. Loving someone you can lose. Someone who's fragile and mortal and temporary. The pain of it. He shook his head. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, let alone my son. Understanding crashed over Lena like a wave. You think he'll fall in love with someone unsuitable? Someone mortal? I think he has a soft heart in a hard world. And soft hearts break easily. They stood in silence, so close Lena could feel the cold that always surrounded him, the absence of warmth that marked him as something other than human. Not all mortal love ends in tragedy, she said softly. Some of it is worth the temporary nature, worth the pain of loss. Because the alternative is a life that's safe and long and empty. Alexander's eyes searched her face. You've thought about this a great deal. I've watched you for 13 years. Watched you be alone because you're afraid of losing someone again. Watched you love Dmitri but hold him at arm's length because getting too close might hurt if something happens. She took a breath. And I've watched you look at me sometimes like you're seeing something you want but can't let yourself have. The words hung in the air between them, dangerous and true. Lena, Alexander said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a warning and a prayer. You don't know what you're saying. I'm 20 years old. I know exactly what I'm saying. Her heart hammered, but she held his gaze. I've loved you since I was 12. Probably before that if I'm honest. Not because you're a king or because you're powerful. Because you let yourself care about a little boy even when it made you weak. Because you listened to a 7-year-old kitchen girl who spoke forbidden languages. Because underneath all the ice and distance, you're still capable of love even when you pretend you're not. Alexander closed his eyes. This is impossible. Why? Because you're 20. I'm 347. Because you're mortal and I'm not. Because I'm your king and you deserve better than. Than what? Than someone who sees me? Who trusts me? Who spent 13 years letting me into his life piece by piece? Lena reached up and placed her hand against his chest, where a heart had stopped beating centuries ago. I don't want better. I want you. For a long moment, Alexander didn't move. Then, slowly, his hand came up to cover hers. If I allow this, he said quietly, if I let myself want you the way I've been trying not to want you for years now, I won't be able to let go. Do you understand that? Vampires don't love casually. When we choose someone, when we bond, it's absolute. Eternal. I would want all of you for whatever time you have, and when you die. His voice broke slightly. When you die, I'll have centuries to remember. To regret. To grieve. Then we'll make those years count, Lena said. We'll make them so full of love and life that the grief will be worth it. Alexander pulled her hand away from his chest, but he didn't release it. Instead, he brought it to his lips and kissed her palm, the gesture so tender it made her breath catch. This is a mistake, he whispered against her skin. Probably, Lena agreed. The court will object. They'll say you're using your position to seduce the king. That I'm taking advantage of someone in my employ. Let them talk. We've survived worse. Alexander looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his ancient eyes finally surrendered. God help me, he said and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was afraid she might shatter. But when Lena kissed him back, when she wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him closer, the kiss deepened into something that felt like 13 years of restraint finally breaking. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, or at least Lena was, Alexander didn't need to breathe, she saw something in his face she'd never seen before. This changes everything, he said. Good, Lena replied. I was getting bored with the old everything. He laughed, and the sound was so unexpected, so genuine, that Lena fell in love with him all over again. Epilogue. 20 years later. The garden bloomed with night flowers, their petals silver in the moonlight. Lena walked through the carefully cultivated paths, her steps slower than they'd been in youth but steady still. 40 years old. For a human, that meant mortality was visible on the horizon. Gray threading through her dark hair. Lines around her eyes. The beginning of the end. For Alexander, it meant barely the blink of an eye in a life that had already stretched across centuries. She found him where she knew he'd be, standing at the garden's edge, looking out over the kingdom he'd ruled for so long. He turned when he heard her approach, and the smile that crossed his face was the one he saved only for her. "You should be resting," he said in Russian, the language that had become their private code. "I've been resting for 20 years, Lena replied, taking his offered hand. "Since you made me retire from active service and appointed me official advisor instead. You were getting too old to chase assassins through palace corridors." "I was 35. Ancient," he teased, pulling her close. "Practically decrepit." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars. This was what they'd become over 2 decades together. Partners in ruling, in love, in the quiet moments that made eternity bearable. "Dmitri sent word," Alexander said eventually. "He and Marcus have reached the eastern territories safely. The diplomatic summit is going well." Lena smiled. Dmitri had broken his engagement to Svetlana 8 years ago, causing a minor scandal until he'd formed an alliance with the southern kingdoms instead through a treaty rather than marriage. He'd never married, preferring to rule alongside advisors he trusted rather than a political spouse. Some whispered he was waiting for the right person. Lena suspected he simply preferred his independence. "And the grandchildren?" she asked. "Terrorizing their tutors, according to his last letter." Alexander's smile widened. "Your daughter has apparently taught all 3 of them Russian. The tutors are not amused." Lena laughed. Her daughter Anna, born 3 years into her relationship with Alexander, had inherited her mother's gift for languages and her father's strategic mind. At 17, she was already being groomed for a position on the royal council. "They should be grateful," Lena said. "Knowing multiple languages saved this kingdom more times than I can count." "Saved the king more times than that," Alexander corrected, his voice soft. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Do you regret it? The years we've had? Knowing they're finite?" Lena looked up at the man she'd loved since childhood, watched the ancient eyes that had seen centuries but still looked at her like she was everything. "Not for a single moment," she said. "Every year with you has been worth whatever comes after." "I'll miss you," he said, and the simplicity of the statement made it more devastating than poetry. "When you're gone. I'll miss you for however many centuries I have left." "Then remember me well," Lena said, reaching up to cup his face. "Remember the kitchen girl who spoke forbidden languages. Remember the advisor who kept your son alive. Remember the woman who loved you even when you were trying very hard not to be lovable." "I'll remember all of it," Alexander promised. "Every moment. Every word. Every time you made me remember that monsters are just people who forgot how to be anything else." He kissed her, gentle and eternal, a promise that stretched beyond mortality. When they pulled apart, Lena rested her head against his chest, listening to the silence where a heartbeat should have been. "Tell me again," she said quietly. "Tell me how we began." So Alexander told her the story she'd heard 100 times but never tired of hearing. About a 7-year-old girl who'd witnessed a poisoning and spoken 3 words in Russian that saved a prince's life. About a king who'd forgotten how to love until a child reminded him. About decades of partnership and devotion and the kind of love that transcends the temporary nature of mortal life. And in the garden full of night-blooming flowers, under stars that had watched empires rise and fall, a vampire king and his mortal queen held each other and made every moment count. Because some bonds are forged in desperate moments. Some love stories begin with poison and end with devotion. And some truths are worth speaking, even when silence would be safer. This was one of those truths. And it was worth everything.